think that's also going to be a really interesting area, this area of personalization. And I think as these sort of infrastructure problems get solved, I think over the next year, I really hope in the next year to 2 year window, we start seeing an emergence of applications, largely more of a co-pilot experience that, know about me, know about my business, but I'm still in the center of it. I still have my hands on the wheel, so to say, really start to emerge and make a big dent at the application layer. I think beyond that, something that I'm really excited about, and maybe kind of going back to what we were talking about in the beginning with agents that are kind of autonomous and doing things for me. I think that's kind of the North Star of AI for a long time. And I think that's going to be something that, I really hope exists over the next 5 years, my own personal like Iron Man Jarvis-like system.
Hey everyone, welcome to the GenAI Collective podcast. I'm your host, Thomas Joshi, researcher at Stanford. We are joined by Weber, my partner at GenAI Collective, ex-Menlo Ventures, and our guest today, Palak, and we'll get at his background later on. To give you background on the podcast, right? We're bringing the brightest minds in AI to the table to discuss the field's hottest topics and more. Each interview provides some sort of unique perspective on the industry, what our takes are, what we think is going on in the industry on the ground. And so to start off, Paul, just kind of give us your background, where you grew up, education, and your work experiences.
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Thomas and Weber, and thank you all for listening. But yeah, I'm Palak. Been at Madrona for the last year, a little over a year now, focused on investing in generative AI startups and some of the infrastructure that goes behind building those applications. Before Madrona, I spent a couple years at Microsoft working in a various amount of product roles, but kind of spent the last year and a half actually working on the Turing team, which was training Microsoft's internal language models. And my job was to basically go and productize those and work on kind of the early versions of things like Bing's chatbot, Sydney, as well as some of the Office Copilot experiences that are being launched now. And so it was a very natural transition working on some of those things and now kind of investing behind founders building similar kinds of applications in the venture world.
Yeah, and to dig a little bit more into your background, like why did you make the leap to VC and you're from a pretty great engineering background?
Absolutely. I was working on things that I was really passionate about at Microsoft, and it was really interesting, especially in the early days of working with LLMs, where it was a lot of, very speculative, what was possible, and you're kind of taking a bet. And Microsoft was very early taking these bets that are paying off now, but were very, very speculative at the time. What was actually possible with these language models, and not only doing that in sort of a research arm, but actually hiring like PMs and product people, a year or 2 years ago, or even longer, to start building some of that underlying infrastructure to sort of roll out all the experiences that they're doing so today. And so I was having a really great time learning with a bunch of really, really smart people. I got the opportunity to join venture and Madrona in particular a year and a half ago. And, I just met the team there, and it was just a great cultural fit. I think some of the partners there are some of the deepest thinkers in AI and enterprise technology. For decades, they've been investing in a lot of great companies. And, just trying to think about, one of the downsides, I sort of had this intuition that this Gen AI wave was going to be really massive. And I think one of the downsides of being at Microsoft is we were very constrained and limited in our thinking to what actually was best for Microsoft or Microsoft ecosystem. I remember we were working on an early semantic search product, and we were integrating it into Office. And we were, one of the metrics we looked at was session success rate, which is, if somebody is searching for something, what's the likelihood they actually find what they're looking for? It's a very interesting metric. And we, I think at the end of a year, we lifted that metric by like 5%, which was huge at the time. People are, working on this problem for a full year, a bunch of PhDs, and if they can lift it by 1%, that's huge. And the fact that we were able to leverage language models and lift it 5% was really, really exciting. But, I look back on that and I was like, well, these are some of the smartest minds in the world. And, is this really it? Is this really the limit of the technology? And so, having that opportunity to go work in venture and bring those experiences to domains and things outside of that Microsoft ecosystem was really, really appealing.
Gotcha. And so just touch upon, some of what you do on your on the side when you're not evaluating investments. Like it's a Sunday, you're not working. What are you up to? Like, how are you hanging out?
Of course. I mean, love playing sports of all kinds. And one of the things about Seattle is the seasons are very different, and they're different sports you play in different seasons. So if it's the winter and it's raining outside, like you'll definitely see me skiing on the mountain,
Nice.
trying to, do what I can out there. And now that it's the summer and it's super great, I was actually just playing golf on Sunday, and
Nice.
recently been picking up pickleball, which is great.
Nice.
I grew up playing squash, and I was on the squash team at Brown. And it's very much a winter sport here. And in the summer, you just want to be outside in Seattle, and pickleball has kind of been the thing. I've sort of been on that bandwagon now for the last few months.
Yeah,
Cool.
and also I saw you grew up in Fremont just like me, man. You went to Mission San Jose.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. That's cool.
Yeah, I went to Irvington. How you
Very
like in
cool.
Seattle relative to the Bay?
Well, the weather is definitely a lot worse,
Yeah.
especially in the winters. But I really come to enjoy it. Like there's just so much great outdoors and really, really great and smart people here as well. So we're really enjoying it.
I think there's a lot of like hiking that goes on right in the Pacific Northwest, just because the ecosystem is so much different from everywhere else. I don't know. Maybe
So lush.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's the flip side of the rain, right? Like the downside is it's raining and cloudy for a lot of the year, but the benefit of that is you get this really green landscape with amazing mountains and amazing places to go and hike and camp and do all that stuff.
Yeah. Well, thank you for giving us your background and kind of letting us get to know you. Weber, why don't you kick us off with the discussion portion?
Yeah. So based on kind of your work in Madrona, you guys have done a lot of great work in AI, and it sounds like you're focused on that in particular. And I guess one kind of buzzy concept right now is agents. There's a lot of talk about them on Twitter, and they're both buzzy yet somewhat enigmatic because no one is really fully sure what to do with them. So kind of given your perspective, having been around a bunch of these companies, like what use cases do you think will emerge by the end of this year, and also after 3 years when it's gotten more time to mature?
Definitely. I think it'd be helpful to maybe start with, I think define what we're talking about when we talk about agents, but it's this idea of, giving a model instead of a prompt, kind of giving it a task and letting the model go and actually like accomplish that task for you. And I think agents for the last few years have always been this like holy grail of LLMs. Like, beyond the conversation with something like ChatGPT, can I actually tell it to do something and have it go and do something for me? Very similar to an Iron Man Jarvis-like system. I think it's, still this sort of elusive concept. Like we've seen a lot of really great innovation like Baby AGI, AutoGPT, and they just don't really work yet, which I think is why there's sort of some mystique around it. I think there's been a number of teams that have been really going after this. I think, 2 years ago, the leader was Adept, and they spent, millions of dollars building an action transformer model to go and build an early version of an agent. And more recently, you have companies in our portfolio like Otherside AI that are building these personal agents. And so one thing that I've sort of seen is kind of the slope here is really incredible. Like Adept, I think, burned like tens of millions of dollars. And now Otherside has sort of built something very comparable, in my opinion, even better. And they've GA'd it. And they've done it for a lot less than that. And so I think not only has the technology progressed, but the sort of cost and the sort of ability to spin up these things has also gotten a lot better. But I think in terms of predictions, I think, in the next year, I think as long as these models don't really work on their own, or these agents don't work on their own, you're going to have some human in the loop. So it'll be a co-pilot-like system. I think it's a good analogy here is I think about like Tesla self-driving, right? Like the cars can't really autonomously drive themselves, but they can do a lot of things like cruise control and constrained environments that are actually beneficial. And I think agents today can also go about doing some of those things. Like I use Otherside's agent to actually help me shop. Or to help me book a dinner reservation, right? So these are some of these like really early tasks that it can do like really well. I can like order me a pizza.
Wait, that's interesting. I feel like most people aren't aware that you can do that, because that'd be sick for me to use actually.
This is really
opportunistic.
Common.
They actually GA'd
it's really
product.
common. Like people outside of Silicon Valley don't know there's self-driving cars, like cruises that are able to take you in SF. Like there was some like software conference where people asked like, oh, when will you think we'll have self-driving cars? Like when, for most people, they said like 5 years out, 10 years out. But, we already have that in SF. We kind of forget about that.
Totally.
Yeah, that's true.
Totally. I think I have a colleague who took one of those cruises, and I think it's still gimmicky, right? And I think you're going to see these agents go along that same path, right? I think I like he told me like the car like couldn't take a left turn, so it took like 3 right turns or something like that, and they do all these sort of odd things. So, you know, I think in the next year, like we're going to start seeing more and more of these kind of things being built. I think, you know, I'm obviously biased to like what Otherside is built as well. And I think right now that the main challenge is not nailing that UX pattern and figuring out how can you get, you know, like in Tesla, like the driver has to keep their hands on the wheel, right? So how do you keep the sort of human in the loop on the wheel in more of like an assistive co-pilot like experience? And so I think it's going to be really interesting. I think over time, like these systems, we know from looking like things like RLHF and ChatGPT is the faster you iterate, the better they become. So I think it'll be a lot of getting the evaluation data, putting something out there, figuring out what people are using it for. Like, you know, Palak likes using it for booking restaurants. Okay, now can we make it better at that specific task? Right. So I think that's interesting. And it'll be interesting to also see, like, you know, right now you're adapting like OpenAI models and, you know, Cohere models and things that were kind of more built around language and content generation and semantic search kinds of things. It'll be really interesting to see if someone trains a model specific for action, similar to that adaptive approach before. So I think a lot of interesting innovation in this space for sure.
I think you make a good point about the UX, where it's like it requires an entirely new UX or UI to be designed to interact with agents. I think my friend Linus Lee at Notion AI, he was previously spent a year doing a lot of experiments around like how, you know, UIs will develop around AI. And an interesting point he had is that like there's many similar problems to collaboration, like Figma, for instance. Like how do you bash instructions so like when you're working on something, your co-pilot can work it on the same time as you, and you can alter things as well. And there's also like a factor of like, you want to have control, but you also want to have trust that in your case, it can order the pizza for you, handle the payment. But like, at what point do you verify the payment, or how many times do you have to do that before it can do it on its own? There's a lot of design space there as well. And I agree with your point about it being designed for specific context. I think to your point about like self-driving being one context, it's almost because like you're in a car, the UX is already designed for you, right? So it's a lot easier to actually think about it. You just incorporate into the steering wheel. But with most like web apps, you just have a blank screen. So you have to figure out how to use that blank screen as best as possible to interface with an agent. And a lot of that might be fitting into how people use it already, but it's definitely an interesting problem. And I'm excited to kind of see how people go about that. And, you know, in ways like Otherside or other ways as well.
Totally. Just to give you an example, like at Microsoft, when we were first flighting things like content generation and things like Word or in the browser, people kind of freaked out. Like we actually saw some regressions in the numbers. Like everyone's like, wait, what is this thing that's going on, right? So it's also kind of interesting to think about not only how the UX evolves, but how usage behaviors and human customer behaviors also evolve.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I mean, what you guys are bringing up is important. Also brings up an important point of like with this Gen AI wave. I think there are certain areas where there's excellent performance, but also like I'm working on like text to SQL systems, and like I think I think a lot of people with Gen AI think, oh, it's really easy to kind of spin up where you just type in a question about your business and it can kind of query your data for you. And from what I've seen, at least from the academic research, is that like state of the art is like 60% performance. A lot of this stuff out there is like 30%, 40%, where we're just happy to get up like double accuracy from like a double performance off what it was, but it's still not like the 90% that we see a human can do when sort of thinking of a query or thinking of a question and then converting that into a SQL query. So yeah, but you know, moving on, like, you know, when do you think, kind of a separately concept, like when do you think it's intelligent for a portfolio company to train, fine tune their own models versus, prompting some of these large language models coming out from, whatever the adepts of the world or, OpenAI, because this is something I get asked a lot. And from the research I've read, at least in the past few months, you just can prompt the large language model and you don't really need to fine tune a model. I can see maybe areas of like healthcare or finance where that's helpful, but we'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. I come from the school of thought of this idea of general intelligence, right? Where, you're going to have models that just, have that ability to reason across different areas and domains. And I think that's one of the things that's so exciting about this wave of AI, right? Is I don't have to go and, for my use case, go and somehow gather a data set that doesn't really exist, do some AutoML thing, find a model. and only then I can get started. Today, you can just hit an API. And I think that's what's really kind of led to this wave of AI proliferation through these large general models. So, when I sort of answer your question, I always recommend our portfolio companies just start with OpenAI, start prompting that language model and see what's possible. And it's really crazy how far you can get with just prompting, even in today's models. I was talking to a portfolio CTO a few weeks ago, and he said that, this week they discovered like 3 sentences, and that 3 sentences allowed them to create some novel experience that was actually pretty game changing for them and for their customers.
Would you mean like as a prompt, 3 sentences
as a prompt? Literally.
Are those 3 sentences proprietary or?
Yeah, he wouldn't tell me what they were.
Okay, that's funny.
But he had like these 3 sentences, and that led to like a differentiated application experience. And so it's really awesome, right? Well, what you can get out of the box with just prompting. In general, I've sort of, leaned away from saying fine tuning, but that's changing, and I'll tell you why. I think first is, I think about training net new models. Like, what are our models themselves in some ways are depreciating assets, right? Like you sort of see, like look at Adept, right? They built a model, and now it's like pretty commoditized now. You kind of see, maybe you fine tune a base model, and then the base model improves. And now your fine-tuned model off your old thing is not even relevant anymore, or can't produce the same sets of results. I think there's a lot of research recently in this thing called LoRA, or low rank adaptation, which is about taking fine-tuned models and being able to update their weights in a more efficient manner as the base model changes. And I think that's really exciting because it changes the unit economics of actually fine-tuning and justifying it. So I think today just hit a model and prompt it at whatever. But if you do want to have more personalized outputs over your own data or your own proprietary stuff, I think fine tuning definitely is a way to go, and techniques like low rank adaptation actually make it feasible.
What you're saying kind of makes me a little upset, because I spent a lot of like 2020 and 2021 in fine tuning models, like large language models, and like setting a lot of the distributed algorithms around like training these models and fine-tuning them. And now that skill set is like really only like useful if you go to like a handful of these like large language model companies. Otherwise, most people are just going to be prompting an API. And so that kind of makes me wonder, like, well, the people who go and learn prompting now, is that also that skill set, readily going to be kind of maybe not commoditized, but just only useful if you work for a big company? I don't really know, but
it's interesting. Like I think there's it's open debate. I was at Snowflake Summit last week, and Snowflake is your data store of all the information within your company, and they're talking about, well, hey, we have all of the data in theory that a company has. It's all stored in the Snowflake database. Can we offer a native compute service and allow tenants on a per tenant basis to train their own custom model using that proprietary data? I'm not sure if how successful that's been. I think they just announced its private preview right now, but that is an example of our company's going to want to train proprietary proprietary models based on their own data.
Gotcha. And I think moving forward, I think we had a question around OctoML and Fixie that we had.
Yeah, I think like one thing that's interesting is like a theme I've noticed with Madrona is like OctoML is bringing AI models to the edge, and Fixie is bringing AI agent to the enterprise. And I think the common theme here is that they have a shared theme of taking AI and bringing it to new contexts and packaging it up in such a way that they're well positioned to be used by the customer. So in your view, what are some opportunities for new startups to bring AI to new contexts where they haven't been deployed yet?
Yeah, definitely. I think the OctoML and Fixie teams are both honestly incredible teams and are doing a lot to make it easier for different companies to work on their generative AI strategy. I think today there's still more problems than there are solutions with using language models, as anyone who's worked with language models can really attest to. I think there's sort of 5. I think models today are still really hard to use. OpenAI models are great because you have an API to work with, but there are all these open source models that exist today. And the question is, how can I like leverage them in an efficient way It's difficult. I think OctoML has done a lot of really great work with providing a unified API to work with these models, but there's still a lot more that can be done. The second is these models are really expensive to run. Especially, I think one of the downsides of working with OpenAI models is they are really big. And so they're really costly to run in production. So what are some new techniques and new ways to make these models more cheap, more efficient to run? I think there's a concept of model distillation that's out there, where you use a bigger model to train sort of a smaller model. That's an exciting opportunity. I think there's a few different startups going after that. The third is, how do you evaluate a model, right? Like you have all these open source models, you got OpenAI models. You're like, okay, well, how do I know which one's better, right? Do I fine tune something? Do I use like a retrieval augmented thing? Like, how do you actually know? I think that's going to be one of the really exciting, research areas, or maybe even opportunities to start a company around how do I actually evaluate my model? And if people are going to be spending millions of dollars training new models, or even just leveraging these models, you're going to want to make sure that you're evaluating it properly. I think, two more areas that we're excited about. One I'm particularly excited about is personalization. We were kind of talking about this previously with fine tuning. But, if I use ChatGPT or one of you two use ChatGPT, we're not really going to get that different set of outputs, right? But if I'm trying to use ChatGPT to generate content for my business or for myself, or even make decisions for me or for my business, I want it to know about me and my business, right? So how can I personalize some of these things, whether that's through fine tuning, whether it's through something like retrieval augmented generation when you load data into the prompt, or whether it's through, long-term memory store, like a vector database. I think these are all like really exciting ways people are going to use models. And then I would say another area that we're really focused on right now is about security and compliance, right? So now if I'm using data, my own personal data with a model, like that's a security threat. Or, we kind of start seeing like adversarial attacks against models, like prompt injections, et cetera. I think that's going to be another really interesting opportunity over the next 6 months. It's just better security tools around using these models.
And it seems like on the security and compliance side, like there are things that are being done to address some of these issues. Like federated learning is being used to train models in a secure way. It just seems like what's being done right now in security and compliance to protect models and protect data is also kind of greatly inefficient. Where if current some methodologies where you're not having to train models locally, like everyone has their own model and we can train that individual model. Like it's centralizing that in a large compute, like training across 128,000 GPUs or what have you, is just so much more efficient. And it's also what's being done right now. And it seems like if the future is moving towards kind of a more protected, secure way, it's also maybe even more costly. But anyways, and you talk about kind of personalization, right? Like that was kind of the reasons why I moved to like retrieval augmentation, is because yes, the skill of like fine-tuning models wasn't as important as I hoped. We could still almost have everyone fine-tune a model, quote unquote, in a way by prompting it in a correct manner, where maybe you can't change the exact model weights, but you can still kind of give the model get the model to act in a way that you want by kind of just interacting with it and talking to it. And that's one of the kind of inspiring things that I found with in-context learning. I mean, you talk about like evaluation, like maybe we could kind of drill down there. Like, are you referring to kind of model performance in deployment, or like new metrics, like maybe like throwing out precision and recall and coming in with new metrics on that front? Or maybe we could dig down there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think evaluation is going to be one of the toughest challenges that builders face when developing new applications. Like we just talked about, you talked about in the personalization thread, a bunch of different ways people can do personalization, right? You can do this retrieval augmented generation thing. You can, use your own data and fine tune a model. The question is, which one actually has better outputs, right? That's what you actually want to know. And I think it's really hard to decide, if it's like a summarization task, how do I know this summary is better than another summary? I don't think there are objective methods today for evaluating some of those things. And I think it's really important, right? Because, I've talked to a number of people over the last few months, and everyone kind of has their own thing that they're doing. I talked to the CIO of a big bank, and they're focused on fine tuning. They're saying that, the corpus of words that we use in finance is very different than the web. And so the model weights actually have to be different for our use case. Or you have a company in our portfolio now called Typeface that's actually using all of them. That Typeface is focused on creating personalized content generation for large enterprises, and they're helping enterprises fine-tune models. They're helping them use retrieval augmented generation, helping them load data into a vector store, and kind of using all three of these methodologies to create better personalization. So I also don't even know if it's an either or. It's normally a combination of everything. And I think the jury's out on how do you evaluate these things.
Yeah.
It almost sounds like it's almost going to verticalize, where like a lot of different tools are going to be used, or different methods are going to be used for the service of one industry in particular, as opposed to one horizontal startup serving all industries. Just because there are so many different ways you can, I guess, skin a cat in this situation, kind of tailor it towards the best user experience or enterprise experience. But curious if that's a trend that you've seen as well.
Yeah, definitely. We've definitely seen a number of companies that are going after more horizontal use cases, but there are also great examples of companies that are, building a vertical specific model, for instance. And even the horizontal ones really, verticalize at some point in their go-to-market motion. So
yeah,
definitely super true.
I mean, on the topic of standardization of metrics, like there are some papers or studies I see where the output of the model is then judged by OpenAI's like DaVinci, or like they'll speed it as a prompt and say, does it sound right? And they just scale that out like as a metric. Like that's unbelievable. Like you're using the same model you're using to make the output. You're gonna go back to the model. It's like, does this sound valid? Like,
right. I'll give you an example there, right? So at Microsoft, as a PM, my job, actually, one of my key sort of responsibilities was developing our evaluation strategy. So even if we're doing a search system, how do you actually know that the results you're outputting are actually good? And the first thing you can do is you can just use humans to, go and look at it and come up with some methodology, right? Of, hey, this result is good for this reason. It had, this word in it, or it had, it was this long, or it was of this sufficient quality, et cetera. And it's really hard to make those guidelines, but you need to have some guidelines in place. The second thing I think that has been interesting is not everyone can go and afford, hiring 10 people whose job it is to go and evaluate model outputs, right? Or do kind of a scale AI mechanical Turk type thing. And so it's been interesting to see people actually use models to evaluate models, which, it's as good as you can maybe do for cheap, especially when it comes to like offline strategies. In my opinion, the best is just to run things online, which is just put it in front of your users. In fact, just to plug in other portfolio companies, Statsig is building kind of this next-gen A/B testing platform, and we've been spending time on how can you adapt that A/B experimentation mindset that's kind of more traditional to software development to machine learning, right? So can I, the best way to know what the best summary is that's the one my users are engaging with more, or the best way to know that this content, if I'm building a content generation thing, are the suggestions that I'm providing good? Well, let's see which one the user accepts more. Between these different models. And so I think we're going to start seeing that more as software becomes more probabilistic, people running these experiments online and figuring out, what are the best inputs to tweak to get the best output results.
You had an interesting point there about like adopting kind of Statsig's approach, and how Statsig uses like traditional A/B testing, kind of modernize it in some ways. And you mentioned something interesting about how software is getting more probabilistic. Right. So I guess in a more probabilistic world, which I assume you're saying that because AI is very probabilistic in how it determines what to give you, how do you design software products to be the most effective relative to what the world was before? Like, what's the process now?
That's going to be super interesting. So yeah, if I'm building a ChatGPT and I ask it a question, the developer, I don't know what it's going to output. The developer doesn't know what it's going to output. Nobody knows it's going to output, right? So I think it almost goes back to our first discussion, which is what are these new UX patterns that really emerge? For example, we have a company in our portfolio called Outbound, and they're focused on creating these actually phone-based assistants that can go and solve a lot of healthcare, kind of the manual labor that happens in healthcare, like getting like a pre-authorization request, or figuring out like what the insurance bill is, and you know, what's the pricing, and there are all these like redundant phone calls people need to have. But now with outbound, you can have an AI assistant go and just make that call for you. And so now instead of having one person per call, you actually can have like one person have like 10 calls at the same time because they're using AI agents, right? And so it's going to be like very interesting to see what those UX patterns emerge, right? Like, you know, maybe the AI messes up, and so you do have to alert the person. So then it's like, how many calls can they have at once? And so it's going to be really interesting to see what those UX patterns people design and converge around are.
Yeah, and also like because of probabilistic, let's say that, you know, that AI has 100 phone calls and it messes one up really badly, but the other 99 go fantastic. Do you change anything, or do you like accept it? Because that was just one conversation, right? Like, how do you know how to improve it so it's 100 out of 100?
I think you have to be comfortable with the fact that it's never going to be 100 out of 100, and so that also sort of limits where AI is possible, right? So if you look at AI today, it's gotten very popular in creativity tools where you don't need determinism, right? By definition, creativity is sort of unbounded.
But how do you take that one conversation that went wrong?
I think in that specific case, I think you draw the analogy to the autonomous car. The autonomous car doesn't need to know every situation; it just needs to know when to pump the brakes, right? And pull over. And so I think those are kind of some of the guardrails that you'll probably start seeing. Like the model doesn't necessarily need to know how to do everything, but it should know when it's probably wrong. And when to pump the brakes.
I mean, I agree. I think also we'll see. So we talked about kind of on the engineering side, but also I think in the business contract side, like the way we used to be able to do like system service level agreements in your software contracts, where you could say like to the, you know, the fifth decimal, we guarantee service and delivery of whatever. If you're building a CDN, like we'll see less of that those guarantees, and maybe it'll be more almost treating like an agent as a human being, and that like you can't, if you're in a service business, you can't really guarantee the level of, or quality of the service. Like how do you make more precise, you know, business contract guarantees on that, right? So I think it'll be more treated as like these are human, almost like humans. They act in their own manner, and we can't control their output, so we can't make the sort of deterministic guarantees we used to do when we were talking about software systems. So that'll be interesting. Yeah, I mean, and like, you know, maybe on a separate topic, like if we're kind of still in the early innings of this platform shift, right? So we're moving from like Web 2.0, and where, you know, we've seen like cloud, mobile, social network, social mobile gaming. Like what needs to occur for that next platform shift to happen, where generative AI is the platform? Like we've heard a lot about that from people, where they're saying like you need to be building extensions, because like the next two platforms are like, you know, are AR VR with some of Facebook's and Apple's initiatives, and then also in ChatGPT plugins or extensions.
Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, it kind of goes back to some of the problems that I highlighted, you know, models being hard to use, expensive to run, hard to evaluate, you know, they provide generic outputs, and they're vulnerable. I think these are all areas that are still open research topics that, you know, they provide a lot of opportunity, and these problems need to be solved for us to kind of move from the early innings to the middle innings. I'll give you an example. I think all of us are finding ways to use ChatGPT to make us more productive at work. At the same time, you know, I've talked to a number of CIOs and CISOs over the last few weeks, and they're all telling us, you know, we're sort of banning ChatGPT within our organizations because, you know, people are putting in our company specific data or our company specific code into the thing, and now it's being used by OpenAI to maybe go train it. And I don't know if that's bad or good, and I just don't want it, right? And so there are all of these sort of cultural things as well that need to be figured out as we sort of progress from the early to middle innings. I think the other thing is it's still like hard to use. Like it's still hard to build these applications, and we're all still learning as society, as a developer community, how to build, even beyond that as a world, like how to actually interact with these probabilistic systems and these new UX patterns that we talk about. So I think it's really, you know, one of the things that we've really been investing around at Madrona is the new like tools, like the new like picks and shovels that make it easier to build generative applications. And the sort of idea there is the easier and easier you make it, the more accessible the technology becomes, the more novel applications people are going to be able to build, right? Like probabilistically speaking, the sort of next big Gen AI app is probably not going to be built by, the best researcher at the best research lab who's the only person in the world to, know how to work with LLMs, right? It's probably somebody who really understands the domain really well and understands the problems, the customers are having. And now, because generative models are so easy to use, because all these problems are being solved, they're able to leverage that technology to create a solution to their customer problems that just wasn't possible before. And I think that's when you're going to start seeing some really cool new applications and use cases light up.
And also one of the questions is, how quickly will that transition happen, right? So a framework I use to view kind of model development, it's like, if you look at kind of like fab companies or like a TSMC, like TSMC enables the creation of NVIDIA. Without any TSMC, there is no NVIDIA. And in the similar way, like in order to create manufacturing capabilities, it requires a whole lot of CapEx. So like in our case in AI, it's like it takes a lot of GPUs up front. It takes a lot of training compute costs to get it up and running. And then once you have that up and running, you have that large language model, other people can use that to develop their own designs and different ways of prompting it. So you could almost view the analogy as TSMC is like the large language model developer, and then NVIDIA is someone who's really great at prompting it and knows how to get the best performance out of that. And so maybe the enabler to that platform shift isn't necessarily, we don't need to look down on prompt engineering as much as like engineers typically do, because it's actually a critical function, right? Prompt engineering is really a matter of how do we have this machine set up, how do we get the best performance out of it? And just because it's not being written in code, maybe it's just being written in prompts, we can create pipelines around those prompts and systematize the way we write those prompts. So I think like you bring up a good point. I mean, like, are you, kind of from that perspective, I mean, are you worried about kind of the capital expenditures required to fine tune a model? I mean, are you thinking about kind of the financial impact that might have on business performance? Like, I'll give you an example. It's like in the 90s and in the 2000s, a lot of companies were afraid to move to cloud software from on-premise because of just how high the gross margins were when you had on-premise software. And so that might kind of discourage a lot of people to take on that compute cost of moving to SaaS. I mean, are you concerned about that, of companies moving into sort of fine-tuning models, or is that kind of, if they have to, they have to?
Yeah, I think the sort of expensive nature of things is both a problem and an opportunity, right? So let's kind of take both of so when I worked at Microsoft, right, we were working a lot with the Bing team, right? We were trying to build this sort of chatbot, this next gen search experience using LLMs within Bing. And, one of the best advantages that Bing had over Google was it had maybe 2 orders of magnitude less traffic. It's like, how can that be an advantage? I can actually fundamentally change the economics of search by spending more on these models and creating a differentiated experience that I think Google has sort of had a hard time matching. Like, I think the Google Bard platform is significantly worse than the Microsoft Sydney platform. And it has to be, because Microsoft it doesn't have to serve the same level of traffic that Google does. And so can spend more dollars on creating a novel search experience, as well as, they get the ROI, right? Like if Microsoft spends $1, there's a chance that, I think Bing revenue's like doubled over the last year. And it's a $10 billion business. That's like pretty good in terms of like, dollars, active users, et cetera. And if you look at Google, right, like Google's entire business is based on search. So if they actually like, to your point, like fine tune models and build all these like novel things at the same level, they're actually like impacting the gross margin of their business, right? Which is really challenging. And I think that's one of the reasons where they've sort of struggled to keep up. Now, sort of on a flip side, right, like when we were building, search experiences and different AI powered experiences in Office, all of a sudden, like you're kind of the winner, right? You're already the leader. So you kind of have to be like really hesitant about, am I really moving metrics? Do I have to think about maybe a new consumption-based business model? The same way like SaaS and on-prem kind of different business models. How do I like, find a way to charge more dollars to my user or without sort of impacting kind of the gross margin of my existing product? And that's where I think there's a lot of opportunity for startups to go in and come out the gate with the consumption-based business model or sort of, kind of what Bing did to Google. Can sort of a new startup do that to Office or one of these other existing things? I think that's going to be really interesting as well.
100% agree with you. I mean, like And the reason why I asked that question is because I think the business models of Google or a large incumbent make it harder to move into new technologies because it's not in their advantage to them, right? So like Oracle and Salesforce could have both made a move to CRM, but Salesforce was just better positioned because they were new at the time, and they didn't have to sort of maintain this financial profile. They could create from the start a new business model and go after that opportunity in a way that the big incumbents just couldn't do. And even if you look at the database was invented at IBM, and like that could be taken by Oracle, and sort of that opportunity was capitalized on by Larry. In the same way, just because transformers were created at Google, like that doesn't mean that Google is in a position to capitalize on it. There might be an Oracle that comes around that can a new incumbent that can capitalize on this innovation that happened at Google. So actually, closing question, and what we're wondering is kind of high level, what is the Gen AI industry going to look like in a year, right? So maybe if it was 5 years ago, we'd be asking what's going to happen in 5 years, but from what's been happening in AI with the events and the papers being published and the work being done, we really probably can't say what's going to happen in 5 years, but at least give us what you think is going to happen in 1 year.
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough question. I mean, even if you look at, where we were a year ago to where we are now, it's super different. Even a month ago to where we are now, it's super different in terms of the proliferation of models, things moving beyond just OpenAI and kind of the big tech companies. And we're now starting to see, the last 6 months, so much innovation around things like LangChain and all of these sort of tools that have become more prevalent in solving some of the problems I talked about earlier and just improving the access of these technologies. And so all of this to say, it's really hard to make a predictions a year out, but I can kind of maybe say what I'm hoping for. I think what I'm hoping for is there's just going to be, all these challenges that I talked about. There will be better solutions for, how do you evaluate models? I think personalization is something that we're going to start hearing a lot about over the next 6 months, both on sort of the business side as well as kind of the personal consumer side. Right? Like if I'm a consumer, I want to use ChatGPT to do a lot of these things that I want to do, but it needs to know about me, right? So I think that's also going to be a really interesting area, this area of personalization. And I think as these sort of infrastructure problems get solved, I think over the next year, I really hope in the next year to 2 year window, we start seeing an emergence of applications, largely more of a co-pilot experience that, know about me, know about my business, but I'm still in the center of it. I still have my hands on the wheel, so to say. Really start to emerge and make a big dent at the application layer. I think beyond that, something that I'm really excited about, and maybe kind of going back to what we were talking about in the beginning with agents that are kind of autonomous and doing things for me. I think that's kind of the North Star of AI for a long time. And I think that's going to be something that, I really hope exists over the next 5 years. My own personal like Iron Man Jarvis-like system that can go and actually, do things for me. I think that will be sort of really amazing to watch people go and build something like that.
Okay, perfect. I mean, thank you so much, Paul, for that, for your thoughts there. I mean, Weber, is there what kind of stands out to you? I mean, what do you kind of take away from this conversation?
I think the points you had on the UX context and how that'll be designed and how to improve that over time, I thought was an interesting theme. And I actually just thought of one question I want to ask you. The future is obviously very uncertain, but as an investor, if you could ask one question to a magic ball that would give you the answer, that would help you invest in AI, what would it be? It could tell you anything about what's going to happen over the next 5 years, and it would help you invest. So what do you think you would ask?
I have mine. So if you don't have it, it's okay if you don't have it.
Yeah, I would just ask it to tell me, who is the ones building those things, and how can I get connected to them?
That's a good answer. That's a good answer.
The hardest part.
Yeah.
I would probably do something around like training models, like how much it would cost, like the number, like in terms of like number of GPUs, like how efficient we'd be. Because if you know that, then you could predict like what companies or how much capital you want to deploy right now, like at this. Because the way I view it is like as costs come down, the cost curve comes down, like there'll be new opportunities that open up. And so if you can kind of plot out, I guess what I'm thinking is like if you could plot out kind of the cost of training, like there'll be and kind of the accuracy and performance of models, like you could also kind of have a perspective or framework around when you want to deploy capital and where that would be best served. Just because like as we improve model training and performance, there'll just be different paradigm shifts that will occur at each of those kind of major steps. Like when we had like GPT-3 and GPT 3.5, that was a big paradigm shift. When we had attention is all you need paper, the LSTM model, going back to whatever you keep going back, like knowing that curve is so critical. If you couldn't, obviously you'd want to know who makes the most money, but like if we if we can't ask the more direct questions, like that's a more indirect way to getting there.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think mine is like, what is like the Amazon equivalent in terms of like, what is like the large application layer company that gets built, and why are they successful? So I can go build it.
Yeah, true. I think my biggest takeaway from the conversation is around model evaluation. This is something I should spend a lot more time on in my own research, because someone from a model evaluation company was asking me, like, how do I evaluate model performance? And I just realized I kind of just, test against a benchmark, particularly question answering benchmarks, and whatever, if it gets right, that's the level of accuracy I kind of use. And I think the reason why I haven't used more advanced metrics is because when I was trying to do A/B testing when I was an ML engineer, it was just such a headache. Like setting up SageMaker endpoints was just very annoying. And so like, we always planned on doing A/B tests. It just was a headache to manage. And there's plenty of tools that have come out, like open source tools that have come out to help people manage different models. Like I think OctoML, shout out to OctoML, has a solution there. But my biggest takeaway is just think a lot more about model evaluation and how we can do that at scale, because the outputs are just so fuzzy that just a simple yes or no won't be able to do in the future. But
totally.
with that,
I was just going to add, like, that's actually something we look for, like when we talk to kind of these early application developers, is what's your evaluation strategy? And that's actually been a really good way of differentiating kind of some of the folks that I think really know what they're doing and people kind of just getting started.
Yeah, I mean, Palak, with that, like, is there any other takeaways that you just one or two takeaways that you'd want kind of the audience to come away with, just in their development as AI founders, engineers, researchers, in their investing style?
Yeah, I think just kind of the first thing is we're still super early on this wave of innovation, and if you believe that there is a future, then there are lots of great problems to be solved, and new kinds of applications and things like UX that need to be re-envisioned. And so be highly encouraging of everyone who wants to build and contribute to the space. That's my first one. And then second, I think it's just a super exciting time right now. I think, kind of very similar to what I was saying originally, is just there's just so many unsolved problems, so many green fields to go after, and there are just not that many moments of opportunity like that. And so just want to be highly encouraging of everyone to go out and tackle problems that you find interesting, whether it's evaluation, whether it's security, whether it's what Weber was saying, which is trying to find that like next big application company. Highly encouraging of that.
It's crazy too, Weber, you bring up a really good point that I didn't even think about, which is like there were so many sort of folk, in 2000 there were so many websites that were just focused on selling one product, like I don't need books or name your consumer staple, and
Amazon.com or something.
Yeah, exactly. And what no one predicted was that no, it was just going to be one website for everything. Like with search, like there was all these search engines. Like no, it was just going to be one that dominated. It wasn't going to be fractured. Like it wasn't going to be Alta Vista and Yahoo all at the same time. It was just going to be one. So that's a really great question.
Yeah, I think one of the analogies we like to use at Madrona is we try to compare it to mobile. And if you kind of look at the first days of mobile, you kind of think of big incumbents kind of winning, so to say. Like the New York Times launches a mobile app. Okay, that makes sense, right? I can now go on the New York Times app. But then you kind of see, well, what are startups doing? They're building like CubeRunner. They're building Doodlejump. They're building like a flashlight application. They're building that app that you can put it like this, and if you tilt it, it looks like you're drinking beer, right? Like all those kinds of things. And now when I look at like what are people building today, it's a lot of like chat your docs, right? Like chat your data, which I think are really early use cases and kind of the flashlight app of this sort of era. Obviously maybe a little bit more useful. So it'll be interesting to see, it took 2 years after the launch of the App Store to see companies like Uber and Instagram, kind of mobile native companies, get built. And so, that's, I think, what we're all looking for is in the next year or two, are we going to start seeing like a very strong generative native application get built?
Yeah. Like, I guess the equivalent for mobile is Snapchat, and that was not possible, and Instagram, because those were not possible prior to mobile. We're uniquely enabled by mobile. And I guess with AI, I think the innovation will be, we don't have any new screens to play with, but it'll be like, how can we use the existing screens in a way that only AI allows? So I think there'll be a lot of innovation. Like the new Snapchat and Instagram will have a unique differentiation in terms of the UI, in my view, in the way people interact with it. So I think that's a good comparison to make like mobile.
Yeah, wow. Well, a lot to think about here and a lot to take away with as we build, as we invest, as we kind of collaborate. Thank you so much, Collective Nation, for tuning in and listening to us in this conversation with Palak, and it's doing brilliant work at Madrona. Thank you so much, Palak, for joining us and taking the time. We really appreciate it. And yes, so thank you for listening, and hope to see you next time.
Thanks for having me.